Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Breakfast with Arup. It's good to see you all here. Thank you for braving the cold. My name is Farah, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Leader for Buildings London. And so to our speaker this morning. Edward Hall grew up in South London in Balham. His grandfather, great-uncle, and father were all engineers by profession and were versed in the art of making. All had cellars for spare parts and were avid sailors. Growing up in this atmosphere of taking things apart and mending, when applying for a degree at university, Ed had not really made his mind up as to what he wanted to study. He was searching for a suitable degree and came upon one titled Civil Engineering. He decided that's what he would like to be when he would grow up, finally, a civil engineer. He duly applied to Bristol, and at pre-university mock interview, he was told that if he wanted to study engineering, he had better go and work for Arup. Initially sponsored by the firm for 8 months, Ed diligently returned every summer holiday to work for 6 weeks during his degree. That's sad. Ed joined the firm in 2000 and worked initially for Arup Architecture for 3 years, and then he decided to work abroad in New Zealand. After a 2-year stint abroad, he returned to Buildings London and decided to specialise in sustainability. During this 5-year period, Ed worked on incubating total design projects. Inspired to work overseas again, Ed went to work in one of our offices in South Africa. Working as part of a multidisciplinary team, he delivered a stadium, surveyed diamond mines, and worked on the recently opened Zeit Museum of Contemporary Art in Cape Town, South Africa, with Thomas Heatherwick. Since returning to London, Ed has been working on a range of projects, including Chelsea Barracks with Paul Davis and Partners, Bracken House with John Robertson Architects, which will be the new headquarters for the Financial Times, and data centres with Equinix. A child of the gaming generation, Ed uses his boyhood passion as a way to inspire his project teams. He believes a virtual world is one to be explored. And taking his passion forward, Ed has developed 3D models, bringing to life designs that are fun and engaging and for clients to play with and explore. And so, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce the very special Edward Hall. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Farah. I'm sorry I didn't have any jokes for you. Morning, everyone. It's early, it's almost Christmas, so I'll try and keep this cheerful enough to move us all along. I'm going to start with Carl Sagan. Now, Carl Sagan was an astronomer, principally, but the reason I at least know of him, he was a science educator. He spent his whole time frustrated by the fact that he couldn't understand why so many people are interested in talking to astrologers. So few people want to talk about astronomers. He used to ask himself, why is there an astrology section in every newspaper? Why isn't there an astronomy section in any newspaper? So I thought I'd use his quote as a starting point for this talk. For me, he said, it's better to grasp the universe as it really is than to persist in delusion, however satisfying and reassuring. It's a nice challenge for us all, so obviously I'll use that as a metaphor. Let's say I'm the planet Earth, my little set of projects is the planet Earth, and then the Arup system is what I'm part of, the bigger solar system, the 10,000 live Arup projects at any one time. Whatever we might think, we're part of a much bigger galaxy, of course, a whole galaxy of projects and firms doing all sorts of work. And this talk is an invitation for us all to look outside our planetary perspectives, to stop thinking purely from the point of view of our little Earth, and look across our projects and across the industry and look for some common themes. The hypothesis I'd like you to consider today is we're working harder and harder. We're increasingly drawn into levels of detail that require more and more sophisticated systems to control. But are we achieving more in proportion to all those extra resources? Are we at risk of losing our state of mutual trust and cooperation? Should be fun. So if Carl worked here, let's try and bring it into Arup. If he was upstairs to number 8, level 4, maybe he would have said, for me it is better to grasp project development, as it truly is, however, rather than persist in delusion, however satisfying and reassuring. So what I'd like to do now is explore that and walk through the project stages as I see them and talk about how this all ties together. Now, in the invitation to this talk, Farah said, I had provocatively stated that most structural engineers can design a building in a day. But I think we all know that structural engineers can do that. And at this beginning stage of a project, we do it maybe daily. We might do a building a day for a week, maybe for a month. And at this early stage of a project, this is a really exciting time. We learn to work with each other. We learn to understand the constraints of our other team members. We learn to make decisions which later on will help us to deliver the project efficiently, on time, to budget, and with reasonable prosperity for all. And of course, as constraints become apparent, as we start to understand each other, as we talk to the architects and to the clients and the quantity surveyors, we all flex how we're looking. Oh, you want something that's thin slab, you want something that's super tall, you want something that's super cheap. And we all learn to understand each other's needs. It's a very positive part of a project. Now, the idea, the driving force behind this talk was from a book called Doing It Differently. It was written on the back of the Egan Report, for those of you who can remember back that far. It was written by my old head of department, David Blockley, and his friend Patrick Godfrey. In that book, where they're looking at the complexities of the construction industry and trying to approach these wicked problems, as they call them, with a system, they say, in our experience, it's common for people to look at how to accomplish a task before they've asked why they want to do that task. And that's what I'd like to talk about. So that's why this stage is so important, this early stage. If you understand why I'm doing certain things on my project, why I'm focusing on certain aspects, maybe that will help you and me to work together to deliver each other's needs. So let's talk about an example. Let's talk about stairs. Now, at this stage of a project, the stairs might be on a drawing, it's probably a rectangle with an X in it. And some people on the team will be thinking about these wonderful stairs, a proper project there. Some other people, maybe the quantity surveyor, maybe the structural engineer, might be thinking more along these lines. Now, of course, both are completely valid. There's nothing wrong with either. What matters, importantly, is that both stairs come with their own risk, don't they? One's probably going to cost more. One's going to have more impact maybe on other design assumptions. But of course, the other one might not be quite so exciting. It might not give you so much money for your building when you let it. And when faced with a challenge to our fee, when we have different views of these two options, people will tend to become defensive. If it's going to affect the cost plan, if it's going to affect your fee, if it's going to affect the design assumptions you made elsewhere and it turns out you misunderstood each other, people become defensive. And what they're really doing, generally, I find, is trying to avoid being found to have been wrong. There's an excellent book, which helpfully is called Being Wrong, by a woman called Catherine Schultz. She talks about wrongness and the stages of wrongness in terms of three assumptions. There's the ignorance assumption, there's the idiocy assumption, and there's the evil assumption. In other words, when someone disagrees with us, when we think they've misunderstood what we're doing, we tend to start by thinking, oh, they didn't hear me. They didn't hear me. I haven't said it loudly enough. We then tend to move to the next stage. They still disagree with me. They obviously haven't understood. Something complicated going, and maybe I'll write it in bigger letters. Maybe I'll talk more slowly. And finally, they move on to evil. No, they do understand, and they have heard me, and they're willfully choosing to do something different. Where have we seen that recently? We see it a lot, don't we? Once people are placed in a situation where they feel they might have been judged wrongly, they might well choose to think that the other side, us, didn't hear, or didn't understand, or are evil. And if ever we've seen some clear examples of what that does, it's here recently, isn't it? Brexit and Trump. What we've seen is a lot of division. It creates division. And that's why it's important here. That's why the stairs, as it were, are important here. Because if they create division within the design team, there's a risk that all that trust, all that mutual understanding, that early work we were doing where we were building things together and considering options can start to fall apart. The key being that there are lots of stairs on projects, lots of things like stairs. I tend to think of them all as stairs. I think it's a great sort of general metaphor. And as pressures increase, as programs get squeezed, as cost plans get squeezed, there's less and less margin for error, and there's more and more defensiveness around the risk of being considered wrong. Now, we can manage stairs. We know how this is done. There are systems. We can recognize and address these things within the life of a project. So going back to your project today, I would just encourage you to think, how many stairs are there in your job? How many systems are there that people are disagreeing about? And would it be to the benefit of the project, rather than trying to prove someone wrong, maybe rather than trying to demonstrate that they misunderstood you, maybe willfully, maybe it's better for the benefit of avoiding division and holding the team together to address it more hands-on, more directly. So I've been talking about trust. I've been talking about mutual understanding. And to some extent, of course, what I'm talking about is risk, all our perceptions of risk. Maybe the most prominent player in terms of risk is the QS. The QS is one of the few people on the team, maybe the only one, who can look across the whole project and make a decision for the whole job as to whether to make some blanket allowance for risk. Maybe they allow 15% on top of the cost plan when everything's written down at stage 3, maybe less. But in my experience, and this is one of the things I'd like to make sure I focus on today, in my experience, no one asked that question directly. Why not? So I wondered why not. So on a recent project in Cape Town, I asked. I provocatively said that I would maybe expect to be a 20% increase on my one-day, two-sketch planning application design. The QS said 3%, which was not the number I had been expecting. But what was interesting is although 3% is a very small number, and I thought we might struggle to deliver it, it did make it clear, suddenly, absolutely clear, why we were approaching things the way we were and what we had to do from here on in. So let's think about risk. Let's think about all the players around this backgammon table. Let's think about Q. Q is interested in innovation. He wants to explore new ideas. He's probably going to put some of his own time and effort and money into making a new and exciting thing happen. Then there's M. M cannot fail the mission. Her focus is going to be on making sure she's got enough hedging that at the end things will be delivered successfully. And finally, James. James is in a hurry. James wants to rush in, make his mark, and get out. His focus is on his own success. He's not overly concerned about a bit of collateral damage. He might take risks on your behalf or other people's behalf, but he'll probably make sure he's okay. So I'd like you all to ask yourselves, do you know the risk profiles of the people on your team? Have you asked your team that they should take an upper bound approach, a best estimate approach, a maximum risk approach? Is it clear what you're asking them to do? Now, in a previous talk, it's a couple of years ago now, by Andrew Lepinier, Andrew asked this obvious question. And he talked about two important focuses for services engineers. One, the ability to communicate, obvious. And the other was to think creatively and actively about risk. Because he has to think about that stuff, because nothing is more blatant, is it, than a services engineer that's been too conservative. A cathedral with a bit of kit in the middle. A huge bit of expensive kit that never gets switched on. Or maybe such an intricate maze of ducts and pipes and wires that you can't maintain them. It's visible. Everyone sees it. And each of those approaches, of course, is justifiable. Each of them come from a specific approach to a project which may well have been defined by what they were asked to do. But the question is, are we asking clearly enough? Do we understand what we're asking teams to do? Okay, so we're through the sort of concept stage. We're getting to the design development stage. Let's call it REBA stage 4, getting to the end of stage 4. All those earlier decisions, those one design a day kind of moments are being locked in. Pressure is building up. The cost starts to build up. Quality starts to be a focus. Program is becoming under pressure. And I'm sure you've all had recent experience of when you have to get the first pile in the ground in 2 months, or you need to finally select that stone before the quote runs out. At that point, obviously, there's less room to understand other team members' priorities. You've got to focus on your own deliverables. And at that point, I would put it to you that the trust in the team that you spent so long building up is at risk. Once my piles are in the ground, it's a bit late to move your columns. You're going to have to fight pretty hard to persuade me that I should have allowed for something extra in my pile design and made myself look like I was being conservative. Maybe it becomes your problem to accommodate the structure. A more positive way of doing that would be to say no. The piles are going in the ground. We all know the cladding system hasn't been defined yet. Let's allow a little bit of extra capacity in our piles, accept that there's an extra cost in the piling package, and then later on, maybe the cladding options aren't so tied down, gives you more flexibility. It's not hard, we all know this, but acknowledging that risk and addressing it directly is what I'd like to emphasize to you today. Because at the end of this process, we all know we're going to have to stand and deliver on all those promises we've made, all those decisions we've made, all of those options we've looked at. And some of those options, some of those decisions are made right back at the one building a day stage. Slab thickness often gets decided so early on, and then 2 years later, you know you're going to have to deliver to it, and that affects how you view it. And all the way through the process, everyone on the design team has an eye on this point. They know they're going to have to stand and deliver. Let's think about those team members again. There's Q. He's been working all through the night. He's proved that he can make this super sophisticated new technology work. M is quietly confident. She's been thinking about it a lot. She's covered herself for a few minor changes. James, frankly, stopped looking at anyone else's information about 2 months ago. He's got his deliverable set, he's out the door, and he's off into the sunset. So my question to you, and what I'd encourage you to do, is to think about how many Qs, Ms, and Jameses you've got on your projects. And have you ever tried to find out? Because what happens now? The tenders come back in, everyone's locked down their designs, and then changes happen, don't they? Change is a broad subject, and we all talk about it a lot in this industry, so let's just do a hypothetical example. Let's talk about a project that I might have been working on recently, where cost is under a lot of pressure. We've gone through countless iterations of the cost plan. It's super detailed, it's thousands of pages long. Everywhere someone has perceived a bit of extra spare design has been questioned and queried. As a result, what happens? I might move. I might have started as Q, feeling a little bit, let's be exploratory. And I might have moved towards more of an M position. Let's get rid of flexibility in return for certainty. Now, when the tenders came back on this hypothetical project, there were 3, and only 1 was within that cost plan. Now, we had no reason as structural engineers to reject that plan. There's nothing wrong with the submission. The only thing that makes us question it really is that it's significantly cheaper than the others. But it fits the cost plan. So who wants to be wrong? Does the client and the QS want to be wrong about the numbers they put forward? Do they want the project to proceed, which might only work if it fits within the cost plan? They do. They don't want to be wrong. So they take the lowest cost plan. Now, there's a number of risk profiles in there, aren't there? There's the risk the client has taken, and maybe the QS has taken in this hypothetical situation. They're being James Bonds, right? They need not to be wrong. They need to have got it right. And we have moved from a position of being Q, with a bit of flexibility and some exciting new ideas, to a position of being an M, where everything is locked down. And the result is, of course, not much flexibility left in the design. Every additional change from that point has to be managed through a whole process, a whole series of extracts and workflows and meetings and coordination. And it becomes challenging. It's a challenging few months for everyone when a project's in that situation. And in this case, the contractor is James Bond too, which is nice. Because the contractor has essentially done what they've been asked to do, implicitly or explicitly, which is to price aggressively, get the job, and then defend that position. It's perfectly valid. But we do have to understand that we've effectively asked for it, even if we didn't think we were. And what's the outcome? It can be this, right? It can be a whole lot of fighting. You can lose some of that collaboration, you lose that mutual understanding. Maybe you have fighting within the design team, maybe you have fighting with the contractor team. But I'm sure we all agree, it doesn't need to be that way. It's not inevitable. But what I would say is that at this stage, when all those decisions have been made at the higher level at the early stages, when maybe the tenders have come back and everything is locked down, that is not the time to try and develop a team-building ethos, to work into collaboration. You can't workshop and getting to know you session your way into a collaborative approach. You need to think about it early on. And I think if we work to try and understand each other's approach to the project, and to risk in particular, we can maintain that mutual trust and understanding. Now, I love this quote. Alex Kempton, a great 20th century civil engineer, I always find this quote inspiring and informative. No amount of optimism by the engineer on behalf of his client will have any impact on the great forces of nature. We all aspire to work in an environment of trust and understanding, but we need to make sure it happens. It won't happen through optimism. So my hope is that when each of you go back to your teams today, you'll go into your next meeting maybe and ask everyone around the table which James Bond character they are. Because when we get this right, we do amazing things, don't we? I like to keep this project's Kericho Cathedral in Kenya. Everything is so integrated, the systems, the architecture, the structures, that of course we had to work together collaboratively. And here it's very visible, but not every project looks like Kericho. But in every project, that same collaboration is essential. None of the components work without all the rest of them. Okay. So I've talked about trust and understanding. I've talked about risk and the way it can affect that trust and understanding. And now I'd like to talk about how we address that. What happens in practice on our projects at the moment? Every control measure, I would argue, is a hammer to nail down those project specifics. And we have a lot of hammers. We have extrajets, vast repositories of information, workflows, tick boxes, RFIs. We have these big collaborative models, clash detection. We have to workshop in submission after the first 1,000 clashes come up at the early stages. We have emails flowing in and out, don't we? Information flying in all directions. Each email, at least if you're going to get rid of it, you need to have at least read the first sentence. So essentially, and meetings, of course, meetings. Is it me or are meetings growing in size? We might seem to invite more and more people to our meetings, maybe because everyone can work at the same time. But as a result, we get more and more actions coming out of these processes. My point being that we're all spending a lot of time nowadays chasing down a large list of small actions and maybe a small list of more complicated actions. The aim being to manage the risk and the uncertainty that might have come in from the earlier stages. Now, When I was researching this talk, I listened again to a series on the radio called Oliver Burkeman is Busy on the BBC, and he explores the idea that all this constant digital activity makes us feel busier than ever, but perhaps that's just an illusion. There are 2 quotes on this program that I'd like to use here. The first one is, "We are drawn to the activities we think we can control, even though they're not necessarily the ones that matter," and that is where the busyness sense comes from. He also interviews a social economist who talked about the way that IT makes it easier to have quantifiable tasks, lots and lots of tick boxes, and on a short time horizon, we feel progress. We feel pretty good. We're sending off emails and we're ticking off objectives. But what I'd like to suggest to you is that we are creating a system where it's increasingly difficult to keep up with all those controls. And the effort involved in ticking off all those boxes could be to the detriment of those earlier, higher level decisions, the ones that really affect trust and understanding. Now, we all would like examples, and we all love sumps. On this building, this level, are dotted around the basement floor, there are some big pits in the concrete slab. Now, they're not below the concrete slab, so they're not part of the substructure drainage system. They're not above the concrete slab, so they're not part of the internal drainage system. They're in the concrete slab, so they're a bit like structures, except they're not structural. And what I've found on lots of projects is that no one wants to be responsible for these sumps. And I sit in meetings, and I look at the bemused face of my client who thinks, I've got a whole team of people, all these professionals sitting around the table. How can it be that no one is just taking this up? Someone is wrong. Okay, they're complicated. There's risk involved with them. The basement's going to smell or it's going to flood if you get it wrong. But what seems to happen, I've found, is that no one will address it head on. And perhaps this is a symptom of other things that happen. Now, I've seen it approached differently, but what I've certainly seen is that we use all of those controls, all those digital devices that we talked about earlier, or I talked about earlier, to try and manage the system. I've seen it where somebody designs a pit, somebody designs a pipe, somebody designs a connection to the drainage, and so on and so on and so on. And then we use all these magnificent tools to manage all those interfaces. But it takes a huge amount of time. And I question whether the focus on that higher level, higher decision level, where you say, okay, nobody wants to be responsible for this, maybe we should accept that no one's wrong, let's just address it head on, rather than allowing it to create division in our design teams, which has a much broader impact. So my question to you guys is, how many situations are there like this on your projects? How many sumps have you got? Not all of them are obvious, but let's think about waterproofing, and lifts, and landscaping, and cladding, not to mention stairs. Now look, I'm not this guy. I'm not the young King Canute holding back the tide of progress. I'm the kind of guy who tries to make computer games out of 3D models in his spare time. I love the technology, but I do worry that these lists of small, achievable objectives distract us from the higher level decisions we're making, consciously or unconsciously. It's those decisions which I think have a more profound consequence for our projects. So I've talked about how we build up trust, and I've talked about how that trust can be lost. I've talked about different perspectives of risk and how that can lead team members to become defensive. I've also talked about the modern working environment and how that might distract us from addressing those first 2 points. Now, I'd like to use this extract from the new engineering contract. Some people see this as a little bit vague. Let's read it out. The employer, the contractor, the project manager, and the supervisor shall act as stated in this contract in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. Now, it's quite a wishy-washy statement, and certainly lots of lawyers have argued about how much weight it has, but this is on billions of pounds worth of construction projects at the moment. And as a statement of intent, I would encourage you all to take it into your meetings, take it into your office, and ask yourself whether the people around the table are operating in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. But most crucially, if they're not, why are they not, and what can you do about it before it causes other issues? Let's take a small project. The Bat House in the Wetton Centre, one of my personal favourites. So tiny, tiny projects. This is easy, right? We don't need a massive digital system. We all understand each other's constraints and objectives, and it works well. But it also works on this beautiful data centre, which is a personal favourite. This is a design and build contract. We were working for Lang O'Rourke. And what I like about design and build, it has its faults, but what I like about it is that it forces everyone to acknowledge risk up front. It has to be priced in, and then you have to work within that framework. The constraints are clear, and you have a shared objective. So I found that mutual trust and cooperation on this project were very, very high level. So to conclude, let us agree to grasp the universe as it truly is. And let me say, we live in a world of evolving technology, and increasingly this influences our day-to-day lives. In the workplace, Those of you in the room this morning will be working on a range of projects, from the elegant installations to enormous timber buildings. Large or small, I would like to advocate that we all remember that ultimately we're all here for the same reasons. We're trying to achieve a shared vision. I'd like us all to take the spirit of mutual trust into our next project, and surely that will set the industry along the right path. And after all, it is Christmas. Thank you. Well, I suppose, are there any questions? Hi.
Yeah, hi. What extent do you think the no-frills approach to kind of professional services impacts on trust and cooperation?
I think, as with all this stuff, it's about acknowledging it. So I think there's nothing wrong with that approach, is there? As long as you accept that it comes with its own impacts. So I don't think, in a way, I find it easier because it's very clear. Because if you're going no-frill, you have to explain exactly what it is you're intending to do. And it takes away, let's take the opposite approach where you say, well, my scope is all-encompassing. Anything that looks structural is in my scope. Then it becomes harder in a way to work out where the boundaries sit. So I quite like it.
It was a great presentation, really strong on people. Looking at the RIBA stages of work and the way projects are run, how do you manage to build trust in a team that keeps changing in personalities and contractors and suppliers at almost every stage or every second stage?
Yeah, well, at some point, that was one of my conclusions of what you need is to try and maintain a constant team, but it is very difficult. I do think, in a way, that's what happens here, is that because we don't address these things head on, because we don't discuss the 3% or 20% that someone's thinking of in terms of risk or allowances, it's not written down. And so what will happen as the personalities change, approaches change. And so we all know a situation where you're working on a project, everyone knows that we're just going to do this certain thing. Someone else joins, maybe a new project manager, who says, oh, we would never do that, absolutely not. And suddenly all that trust has gone. So I think this is why I really want to advocate that people address this stuff head on, write it down, make a decision, make it clear, and own the fact that there is some uncertainty. And that's okay.
How do you encourage interaction if the client decides save on fees and reduce amount of design team meetings or pay less for the engineers to attend meeting with the architect?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a bit like if someone asks you to reduce your fee, let's say. You say, of course, but you have to explain what the implications of that. So, of course, you can attend fewer meetings, and of course, you can have less involvement, but it does mean you'll have to make some more generalised decisions, won't you? Because you won't have that level of detailed knowledge. So I think it's okay, or should be okay, to say, tell you what, I'll only go to one meeting, but then I'll make all my columns the same size. You know, and I think that's completely reasonable. The people who are making those decisions, I think, just need to accept that there are implications to the decisions they make. And if you're going to save on a build cost because if you're going to pay more on a build cost because you save some money on fees, that's okay, but you do need to acknowledge it because you can't then just force everyone to do as much as they would have done anyway. So all of this is about, I think it's just about owning it, stating it, and being clear about it, and not just sort of hoping it'll be okay.
There's nothing worse than receiving a woolly bid document from a client. So how do you think that we as an industry can help clarify that position so that some of that uncertainty disappears?
I suppose to me that's the stairs situation. So you're bidding for, like you say, you're expecting a certain scope in a certain building. You acknowledge there are stairs in the building. I think there's no point in just hoping it'll all be okay. I think what I would suggest is that early on it's about sitting down and writing down and discussing openly what it is you've had to assume in order to reach the submission that you've come up with. Even if it's, in a way that's what lots of this is about, i.e. rather than just sort of hoping you've all got it about right and then potentially ending up with division, potentially causing much bigger issues, start at the beginning, talk about what it is that you've had to decide, and then see whether that leaves any problems.
It was really interesting as a talk. In general, I would say, like, I come from a transport background, and we are dealing basically with development planning in the development planning sector. And it's something to take in mind and think about how you're going to deal with projects, either internally with your team members or externally with your clients and other parties. So I think it's something that we need to consider, like, step by step on the whole process of analyzing analyzing the levels that you are dealing on a particular project, how you are going to take actions, specific actions, in order to have the best result. It is something that we need to take on board. I think everybody that was here today needs to take on board in order to basically optimize the whole process and deliver the best result.
It's really thought-provoking to come to these breakfast meetings at Arup. Ed's talk this morning was hitting the nail with the hammer perfect. It's a great situation we're all in all the time. It makes us think about maybe working a little bit better with each other and collaborating with each other. I really like the analogies, the James Bond analogy. I suppose we all think we're a James Bond character, but in reality we work in teams, and thinking about how we collaborate and work to create a better process, it needs to be highlighted now and again. So I thought it was really fantastic, provocative.
Well, I found it a very enjoyable talk. On a daily basis I deal with change and risk at Laing O'Rourke at Tottenham Court Road. And so I think the whole idea and the whole spirit of collaboration is a very important part of that. In my past projects that I've worked on some very collaborative projects at Millennium Dome, places like that. And I think that whole getting everyone together and that stakeholder buy-in and everyone moving forward positively is a very important part of the start of the project. I think the other critical thing about that, the other couple of points I make, the other critical thing is to make sure everyone buys into that during the course of the project. As problems appear on a project and challenges are faced, it's trying to eradicate that seeds of doubt that start to drift into people's minds. If you keep working on that through the whole of the project, then you've got a better chance of making a success of it at the end.